About financial independence is it means that you don't have to trade your time and labor for money anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily won't do things that earn money, because you can always leave it. You're not chained to it.
This is the Basu Lifestyle Show, the show about learning what it takes to build a superior you, mentally, physically, and financially. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And also check out BasuLifestyle.com to purchase merchandise to support the Basu Lifestyle. We'll be joined by J.L. Collins. He's best known for his international best-selling book, The Simple Path to Wealth. It's helping people develop a roadmap to reach financial independence. J.L., thanks for sharing your time with us today.
Hey, it's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
So how would you define financial independence for someone?
Well, financial independence, I think it's pretty simple to define. It's kind of a mathematical formula. So basically, financial independence means that you have enough money invested, that money is earning enough to meet your needs. So the formula, based on what's come to be known as the 4% rule, says if you have enough invested that 4% of that will meet your annual needs, then you're financially independent. So for instance, if you have $1 million invested, well, 4% of that is $40,000. If you can live on $40,000 or less, you're by definition financially independent. The other way you can look at that little formula is if you take whatever amount you think you need or want to spend each year and multiply it by 25, that tells you how much you need to have invested. So if you say, I need $100,000 a year, you multiply that by 25 and you get, 2.5 million. So that's what you would need to have invested.
So also, I feel like some people are like, oh, financial independence just means that I don't have to work anymore, or I'm doing this to escape. And the biggest thing I think it is to escape kind of being a slave to your job. It's not really like I'm going to never work again. It's like how you were able to take a sabbatical and take a year off or take multiple years off and find what you really actually like to do, instead of just looking at it as I never have to work again. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that the nice thing about financial independence is it means that you don't have to trade your time and labor for money anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily won't do things that earn money. I mean, I still do, and I've been financially independent for decades. I like getting paid. I like working, so there's no law that says once you reach financial independence, you have to stop earning money. Right? I mean,
yeah, there's no law or rule that you have to just stop at that point. It's just a matter of the freedom of it.
Yeah, this is why I don't use the what is the acronym thing? It took me a second to get there. That's the reason I don't use the acronym FIRE very often. I think it's very clever, financial independence, retire early. But that word retire is so loaded for people because, typically when people reach financial independence, they take a hard look at their job and say, do I really want to continue doing this particular work, this particular job at this particular place? And sometimes the answer to that is yes. But a lot of times the answer to that is no. Well, that doesn't mean that you're never going to work again. You're just going to work at different things, and you're going to be perhaps more selective on the things that you choose to work on. So, and then does that mean you're not retired? Well, I guess, who cares? So
yeah,
that's why
it's about sitting on a beach.
Financial independence.
Yeah, it's not about sitting on a beach, because you probably only do that for so long. If you're like, oh, I'm just going to retire and sit on a beach forever. Some people might be able to do it, but I feel like at some point, the majority of people are going to need something to be interested in to kind of focus on.
Well, especially the kind of people who are smart enough and ambitious enough and hardworking enough, frankly, to achieve something like financial independence. They're probably not going to be people who sit on the beach. I've met a lot of people in this community, and off the top of my head, I can't think of anybody who fits that profile. I know a lot of people are financially independent, but and I know a lot of people, including myself, who spend time sitting on beaches, but that's not the only thing they do.
No, because you have to have discipline to be able to get to that point of financial independence. And if you have discipline and you kind of have a structure, you're going to need to find a structure once you're financially independent.
Well, and also work is extraordinarily satisfying. I think what people don't like about work is in most jobs, there's a lack of autonomy. But when you don't have to work for money anymore, then suddenly you have a whole lot more autonomy, even if you stay at your current job, because you know you can always leave it. You're not chained to it. So, but yeah, I think work's very satisfying. At least it is for me and for most of the people that I know personally.
Yeah, and if it's not satisfying, then you have to basically find a way to get to be financially independent so that you can. So you have a goal that you're working towards, and then you eventually move on to this next step.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, for the people who haven't read the book yet, I broke it down into my 5 steps that I would say that if you didn't read the book, you could follow these basic 5 things and you'd be able to reach financial independence if you followed it. So, after I read them to you, we'll go in a little deeper so people actually understand it. But just let me know if I actually hit everything that we need to hit.
All right.
So, step 1, you're going to determine how much you currently make. Step 2, determine how much money you need to live per month and find ways to cut back and also ensure your lifestyle doesn't inflate due to raises, purchases, debt. Step 3, multiply your monthly expenses by 12 for your yearly expenses, then multiply that number by 25. That's your FI number. Step 4, begin aggressively investing into vtsax. Step 5, once you reach your FI number, you can now live off your investments. Your FI number is based on the 4% rule. So basically, if they just followed those 5 steps and didn't know anything further, would they be able to be financially independent?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good framework.
So can you explain how the actual 4% rule actually works, just for someone who doesn't understand what the 4% rule is?
So the 4% rule came out of a paper that was written by a financial analyst, I want to say back in maybe even the 80s, early 90s. And shamefully, I'm not remembering this guy's name. But evidently, he did a lot of research and a lot of thinking about this as he was dealing with his clients who were frequently posing that question to him as, this is how much I have, can I retire? Or how much do I need in order to retire? And through that process, he came up with the idea that 4% was the right number. And it's a very conservative number. And then I want to say the mid 90s, something called the Trinity study came out, and that was done by 3 professors at Trinity University. And what they did is they took periods of 30 years, and they took different kinds of portfolio allocations, everything from 100% stocks to 100% bonds, and 80-20 and 50-50 and through there. So they looked at all these different allocations. And then they looked at different withdrawal percentages over those 30 years. And they compiled all of that data. And these were real numbers over real 30-year periods. And then they took it one step further and said, well, what if we took that same 30-year period and every year we adjusted for inflation? So they had 2 sets of numbers, not adjusting for inflation, adjusting for inflation. And they presented all of this data. And it's very instructive, and in the Simple Path to Wealth, I reproduced several of the charts from that study because I think they're very instructive. And when you look through it, and I think some reporter probably did this, they looked at the 4% withdrawal rate adjusted annually for inflation, and in the study, that was successful 96% of the time. Success being defined as the money lasted for at least that 30-year period, right? And so, of course, that means that 4% of the time it didn't. You ran out of money before 30 years, but 96% is pretty high odds. And so that was how 4% became focused on out of that study, probably also relating back to the work that the financial analyst guy had done. So, but what's really instructive in looking at those charts, which is why I reproduced them, is that much higher withdrawal rates have significant success ratios too. I mean, 5, 6, even 7%, your odds are pretty good. I don't remember exactly where 7% is, but it's like 60, 65% of the time it lasts 30 years. So that's one thing that's instructive. And it reinforces this idea that 4% is really pretty conservative. And remember, we're adjusting for inflation every year. If you don't do that, you're even more golden. But what was striking to me in looking at the numbers is if you took 4% as an example, in most cases, after 30 years, not only had your money lasted, but it had grown dramatically, right? I mean, sometimes starting with $1 million, you wound up with $15 million at the end of the. So I think I don't like the term rule. I think 4% is a great guideline. The reason I don't like rule is I don't think anybody should ever just start withdrawing 4%, adjust for inflation every year and forget about it for two reasons. One is there's that chance that you might run out of money, as small as it is, and nobody wants that. But the other bigger reason is that you're probably going to see your portfolio grow dramatically. And presumably you would want the chance to enjoy that extra money over the years. So I think 4% is a great guideline. I think it's a great place to start, but obviously you're going to want to pay close attention to how things evolve as you go forward. I mean, obviously, if you retire and start pulling 4% and the market takes a 50% drop, which it does on a regular basis, not frequently, but that's something that you need to be able to expect. Well, obviously, you don't want to keep withdrawing 4% probably.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if the market keeps going up, which it's much more likely to do, then, the amount you can pull becomes greater.
Now, was that portfolio an 80-20 split, or I didn't really hear that part of it?
As I recall, and again, you're testing my memory here a little bit, Steve, I think that was based on a 50-50 split.
Okay, so what was it? 50% stocks, 50% bonds?
Right. But also, the more you have in stocks, the more resilient the portfolio is to not working out, because stocks are your engine of growth. And that's a great point, because one of the other interesting things to come out of the study is that if you drop below 50% in stocks, then the chances of your portfolio lasting for that 30-year period begin to drop pretty dramatically. Because bonds, while they smooth the ride, they're not nearly as volatile. They don't have the growth power that you need to survive for decades with your portfolio. So I tell people you never want to go below 50% stocks. And personally, I go much higher, because if you condition yourself to be willing to absorb the volatility, which is critical to investing in stocks at all, then you're going to get a much better result. So personally, I go 80-20.
And that doesn't change based on age? To you?
Not for me. The old formula, I think, is based on an old concept of how people live their life. So the old formula, and I forget exactly what it is, but when you get to a certain age, as you age, you should have more and more bonds as a percentage of your portfolio. I think that was presuming a couple of things that might not apply to the kinds of people listening to us, right? So the traditional life pattern, if you will, is you went to school, you got out of school, you got a job. Hopefully you stayed with that same company for 40 years. You retired at 60 or 65, and then you had no income going forward other than Social Security. Well, and you were only looking at your money in terms of your own lifespan, right? So in that case, yeah, probably increasing the percentage of bonds in your portfolio makes some sense. But the kind of people that I talk to, and I'm going to guess that listen to your podcast, are much younger. They're going to have a much more varied life than that. They might be retiring at 35, being financially independent. And then, maybe 5 years later, they say, I'm kind of bored doing whatever I'm doing. And I'm going to start this company, or I'm going to do this kind of work or whatever. Now their income starts up again. So for me, bonds just smooth the ride when you don't have a flow of earned income that you're investing to do that for you. And I also look at my portfolio way beyond my lifetime. right? I mean, I expect it to last, passed on to my heirs and to the charities I support.
So even though bonds are somewhere around 5%, it still doesn't incentivize you to even pay close attention to them. Like in today's market, you could get like a 1 year treasury somewhere around 5% that you're guaranteed. Then you also have the market at all time highs. It still doesn't make you consider moving a little more in that direction short term.
Well, I think the thing people need to understand about bonds is that the interest rate is directly related to inflation, right? So the real return on bonds is whatever that interest rate is, less inflation. So there's no free lunch. So yeah, we're getting 5% in bonds now, and of course inflation has come down, but it's around 3%. So you're getting a real net return of 2%. Well, a couple of years ago, you were getting 2% on your bonds with no inflation. So essentially, it's the same. And this is again where I'm not a traditional guy in thinking about this, but I don't look to my bonds for income. And that was one of the criticisms I used to get when interest rates were so low, because bonds really weren't throwing off a lot of income. I look at them as ballast. I want them to smooth the ride for my stocks if I'm going to hold them at all. Now, having more income is obviously that's kind of satisfying, but you have to look at it in terms of where the inflation rate is, right?
True. Okay. So since you're not a bonds guy, you're mostly invested into vtsax still, correct?
Correct.
So can you explain what vtsax is for someone who has no idea about stocks, bonds, any of it?
Sure. So vtsax is an index fund, and an index fund basically tracks a certain index and it buys all of the stocks in that index. It doesn't try to pick winners and losers, which is what actively managed funds do. So vtsax specifically is a total stock market index fund, and it's Vanguard's total stock market index fund. And a total stock market index fund basically buys virtually every publicly traded company in the United States. That's about 4,000 companies. Sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's a little less. But when you buy vtsax, you own a piece of every publicly traded company in the US, and that means everybody in those companies is working to make you richer. Another kind of index fund, for instance, is the S&P 500 index fund. I forget what the ticker symbol for Vanguard's is on that. That simply invests in the 500 largest US companies. And that's also a fine choice. These are both broad-based index funds, which means they own stocks across a broad range of sectors. And that's the only kind of index funds I recommend. There are now index funds for almost anything you can think of. You can buy an index fund for precious metals or for energy or for technology, and those are called sector funds. And that's not how I invest. I want to own it all, because then I don't have to worry about what sector is going to be leading and what sector is going to be fading away, because my index fund is self-cleansing. So whatever fades away just drifts down the index, and whatever is doing best rises to the top, and I benefit regardless.
So it's more of a set it and forget it kind of philosophy. You don't have to watch the market every day.
Yeah, you're better off if you don't watch the market every day, because when the market drops, which it's going to do on a regular basis, that's a natural part of the process. Well, that tends to make people crazy. It certainly makes the media crazy, and then they panic and sell. Well, if you don't stay the course through the drops, you don't want to follow my advice, because my advice will leave you bleeding by the side of the road. It's essential that you stay the course. In fact, if anything, when the market drops, that money that you're putting in is buying you more shares. I mean, that's a good thing. So yeah, you want to stay the course and hold it forever. And that's also the nice thing about index investing and something like vtsax is I never have to think about selling it, because it's always self-cleansing. So sometimes people say, well, gee, why not Berkshire Hathaway, which has done fabulously well. In fact, Berkshire is, think for the most part, outperformed the index. But the problem with Berkshire is that what do you do? Charlie Munger has already passed away. Warren Buffett's in his 90s. What do you do when those guys who were the engine behind that growth, when those guys are gone? Now, of course, people like to believe that, the team behind them will remain and the performance will continue. But in my experience looking at actively managed mutual funds, some of which also outperform the index on occasion, when that manager moves on, the performance rarely, in fact, I would go so far as to say never continues. When Peter Lynch left Magellan, and he had a terrific record at Magellan, Magellan was never the same. When Michael Price left Mutual Shares was never the same. So that matters. And that means you have to be thinking about when to sell those things. With vtsax, I'll own it forever. And then if my heirs follow my advice, they will own it forever.
I think that's an important point to make. Is there a percentage of people who actually in funds that actually beat the vtsax over 20, 30 years? Like any fund manager, any financial advisor, what would be the percentage that actually beats vtsax?
So that's a great question. And there's now a lot of research out about that. When Jack Bogle first introduced index investing in 1975, he was ridiculed for the idea that you would just buy everything and expect to outperform. But of course, this is decades and decades later, lots of research, and the research, and you're testing my memory again, but it's pretty definitive. In any given year, something like 20 to 25% of active managers again being people who are trying to pick winners and losers, right? Trying to decide which stocks are going to outperform. Something along the line of 20 or 25% of those will outperform the index in any given year. When you go out 5 years, it drops to maybe 10 or 15%. When you go out 25 years, it's, 5% or something. By the time you get out to 30 years, it is less than 1%. It is statistically zero. Now, of course, there are anomalies, and Buffett and Munger are the two most famous. And there is, by the way, a lot of debate over whether that's just sheer luck that somebody has to, just like somebody has to win the lottery, or whether there is truly, some magic sauce there. I'm inclined to believe there's some magic sauce. I mean, to do that consistently is pretty impressive. But a lot of their success is that they hold on forever. They're not buying and selling all the time, And of course, in the later years, they had so much financial muscle behind them. They could strike uniquely attractive deals, like when they bailed out the big investment bank in 08, 09. I'm drawing a blank on which, but they came up with a sweetheart deal to put a bunch of capital into that, and it paid off extraordinarily well for them. Well, of course, that's not available to individuals.
Yeah, I mean, if you can buy things when they're cheap and sell them when you're expensive or hold forever, yeah, absolutely. But the average person doesn't have that real opportunity.
Well, and in fairness to those guys, in the beginning, they didn't either.
Oh, yeah.
But they're not stupid. And so when they had that kind of fiscal muscle, obviously they flexed it.
And this is their everyday thing. They live investing, where the average person who thinks they can pick stocks, they're not really living investing. They're watching a few YouTube videos, listening to some podcasts, and thinking they have an edge, where realistically, you don't.
Well, I mean, that's a great point. But the other thing is, most of the people who live it every day also don't outperform. Outperforming, as we talked about a moment ago, is extraordinarily difficult. So to your point, for an individual investor to say, I think I can do better than the market, when the professionals who are living and breathing this every day, who have access to information and data, far beyond anything an individual is going to have is, I think it's a bit of hubris. Now, to be clear, individuals do have some advantages over professional investors, the biggest one being that those professionals are measured quarter by quarter. So sometimes they have to make buying and selling decisions that are not ideal for the long term, right? And an individual investor doesn't have to do that. I think that's one of Munger and Buffett's secrets as well, is they never let that tail wag the dog. They always had their eye on the long term. And a lot of, if you're running an actively managed mutual fund, that's a luxury you don't have. And so that's an advantage that individuals have. But it is, I was a stock picker for decades of my investing career, and I did pretty well at it. You can make money as a stock picker. So it's not like it doesn't work. It's just a whole lot more effort, and it's not as effective as indexing. So when I finally embraced indexing, I had something that was more powerful that got me better results, even though my results were okay, but it was a whole lot less work. So why would
it's
you
an average
not?
of 10%, correct? It's 10%
Yeah.
basically annualized.
Yeah, well, when I wrote The Simple Path to Wealth, it was kind of interesting because, I published that in 2016. So I'm kind of putting the final touches on it in the end of 2015. And I have some numbers in there about how the market had performed over the 40 years. To that point, I'd been an investor because I happened to start in 1975. And I went to one of the tools to look up, well, okay, how has the S&P 500 performed over that 40 years? And a little bit to my horror, it returned almost 12% a year. The reason that was a little bit horrifying to me is I did not want to put in the book that people should expect 12% a year. And I was a little surprised that it had done that well because, remember, in that time period, we had two major market collapses. We had the tech crash, and then we had the 08-09 debacle. And not to mention 1987, Black Monday, the single biggest daily drop in history, worse than anything, even in the Depression. We had the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. We had stagflation in the 70s and 80s. I mean, this was not some golden period of time. But nevertheless, the market did remarkably well. So I wound up, if you've read The Simple Path to Wealth, talking about the fact that it returned that 12%, but with two at different locations, but big caveats. I'm not suggesting you can expect this going forward. But still, it's instructive to realize just how powerful a wealth building engine the market can be.
Yeah, when you just follow the simple path compared to trying to, like we said, pick your own. And what would you say, what would be the benefit of a financial advisor? Is there any benefit?
And before we get into that,
Yeah, okay.
you also ignore those big drops. So if you had panicked and sold in 1987 or in 2000 during the tech crash or in 08-09, then you would not have gotten those returns, right? You have to stay the course. Financial advisors, I'm not a huge fan. I'm certainly not a fan in using financial advisors to pick your investments, because as we're talking about, that is the soul of simplicity, right? And too often there is a conflict of interest with your advisor. What's best for your advisor and what's best for you? What's best for you is a broad-based, low cost, and low cost is critical, index fund. What's best for your advisor is high commission, high cost, actively managed funds. And then on top of that, they're going to charge you typically a percentage of your portfolio to manage your money. Well, that's a huge drag on your returns. So that's not a good thing. I suppose, from a more broad-based perspective, an advisor might be useful in helping you chart your financial goals overall. But even there, if the advisor is also managing your money, you have to be so keenly aware of the conflict of interest that person is going to be facing. And I'll give you a great example. Suppose you go to your advisor and you say, uh, I've got $300,000 left on my mortgage. I'm wondering if I should take some of my invested money and pay that off and be mortgage free. Well, there's a lot of different ways to financially think about that. But one of the things that's going to be glaringly obvious to your financial advisor, especially if they're charging a percentage of assets under management, is suddenly $300,000 is not going to be an asset under management for them. Now, can they set that aside in that personal concern and evaluate your question simply based on what's best for you? You would hope so, but it's asking a lot of someone to set aside what's best for them in order to recommend something that is better for somebody else, right?
Yeah, because they're kind of in sales, basically,
Yeah,
technically.
and then the other thing, of course, is people say, well, I use my advisor for my taxes. Well, I use a tax preparer. I have a business and my taxes are a little bit complex, and I just don't want to take the time to do them myself and maybe miss something. I think I'm pretty well versed in taxes. I did some volunteer work with Vita doing taxes for low income people for a while, but I'm happy to spend that money just as to relieve some of my burden and have a second look. But that's not a financial advisor. That's a very specific kind of thing that I pay a very specific fee for. So I don't think you need an advisor if you want some guidance on taxes.
Especially if you compare. So VTSAX has a 0.05 expense ratio, correct? It's in that vicinity, where a financial advisor, you're anywhere up to 1% to 2%, which when you start to actually build some wealth, that's really going to take away from your return.
Well, right. And I think actually VTSAX is down to 0.03, because one of the nice things about Vanguard is by the way they're structured, their motivation is to keep lowering expenses. So yeah, I mean, Vanguard is incredibly cheap to own. And you're right. I mean, an advisor typically will charge something like 1% to 2% of assets under management. Well, if you go back to our discussion about 4%, and that might not seem like much, you're like 1% or 2%, that's not bad. But if you go back to our discussion of the 4% rule, well, that means if you're withdrawing 4% to live on and you're paying a 1% fee, well, now you're paying 25% of your annual income that you're going to live on to your advisor. And suddenly that does become significant. And then also when you do projections as to what drawing that 1% out of a portfolio means over time, the numbers can be pretty dramatic. So yeah, it's not a small thing. And the other thing is, the other thing I would say about it is, by the time you know enough, you shouldn't be choosing an advisor unless you know enough to select well, right? And by the time you have educated yourself well enough to competently choose an advisor, well, you probably could have educated yourself well enough to do it on your own. So yeah, and I do recognize that there are wonderful advisors out there. If you're going to go with one, I recommend going one with charges a fee. It's probably a little harder psychologically to write the check. It's probably a lot easier psychologically to just never see the fee that's taken out, but you're much better off financially. And now your advisor doesn't have those conflicts of interest.
So if you're doing it yourself, just buying into VTSAX, is it better just to set a certain amount and then when you have the money to buy it, or should you buy it at certain times of the year? How should somebody set that up? I know they have to have like their safety fund, but after your safety fund, anything over that should just automatically go in without seeing what the market is even at this point.
Yeah, so I'm not a believer in timing the market. That you invest when you have money to invest, because we never know what the market's going to do next. So the market recently has set new highs, and there's a certain psychology of some people out there that say, oh, it's set a new high, therefore it's probably going to fall. Well, no, that, market does drop periodically, but not because it sets new highs. The stock market is relentlessly climbing. If you look at any chart of the market over long periods of time, you see this line going from left to right and relentlessly up with dips in it, right? And the dips, by the way, look less and less significant the longer the period of time you're looking at. So the market is always going to be setting new highs. And it's always going to be possible that the next day when you wake up, it's going to be down 30 or 40%, right? Probably not in a single day, but that's a natural part of the process. So the best thing to do is when you have earned income flowing in, decide that you are going to spend a portion of that income, hopefully a large portion, to buy the single most important thing you can buy with your money, and that's your freedom. And of course, you buy your freedom by buying in investments like vtsax. You set that up so it happens automatically. And the best thing you can do at that point is pay no attention to what the market's doing. Just keep it going regardless of what the market does. And if you notice the market's dropping, if anything, you should say, oh, wow, that's great news. The $1,000 a month I'm putting in now is buying me more shares than it did before the market crashed.
Yeah, I think it's hard to look at it that way, but if you can find a way to put it into that lens, it'll make it so much easier. And especially too, in the beginning, you're not living off of it anyway. So you're better off buying, like you said, as it's going down. It's going to be above the all-time high by the time you need the money anyway, in most situations.
Well, and the other thing to remember is even when you're living on it, people have this image that, if the market drops, let's say 30%, which is a bad day, bad series of days. Well, that's terrible if I'm living on it because now, I've sold it. Well, you're not selling everything. At least you shouldn't be selling everything, right? If you're following that 4% rule we discussed earlier, well, first of all, vtsax throws off about 1.5% in dividends. So you don't have to sell anything to get that 1.5%. So you're really selling 2.5% of your portfolio every year. Well, yeah, I mean, that's not going to be great when the market's down. But even if the market were down for a decade, which it did during the Depression, 1930s, you're only selling off 2% a year, and eventually the market always goes back up. So as long as you don't panic sell, even if you're living on your portfolio, these drops are not as significant as people are afraid they're going to be.
So to move on to the next kind of topic, what do you think about debt? Mortgages, cars, student loans?
So I'm laughing because I have some fairly strong feelings about debt. So one of the things that appalls me in the modern society that we live in is that debt somehow seems to have become normalized, acceptable. I mean, that well, of course you have debt. That's how you live. That's appalling to me. I mean, carrying debt is like being covered with blood-sucking leeches. It's exactly the same thing, and there's nothing normal about it. I mean, if you have debt, the first thing, job one is avoid debt at all costs. If you are listening to this and you have debt, then you need to take out your sharpest knife and start scraping those little bloodsuckers off, because just like the leeches are draining your life energy, debt drains your fiscal life energy. You cannot become wealthy carrying debt, and especially consumer debt, student loan debt. I mean, I'm horrified that with government support that we have encouraged young people to take on this enormous amount of debt. When I was in college, no lender would have given me money and for very good reason, and I was 18 years old. I had no credit history. I had very little income that all went to, because I was putting myself through school, all went there. I mean, no lenders were offering me credit cards. They would be insane to do that. Well, those days are gone, and they're particularly gone because the government stepped in and started guaranteeing these loans. Well, now the lender is going to look at 18-year-olds differently and say, well, if you're going to guarantee it, well, of course I'm going to loan them money, because I don't really care if they pay it
Did
back.
you see a chart of when the government started backing the loans and what college prices happened? It just went straight up.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but I can predict what it looks like. And that's going to be true of anything. If you can take anything at all and figure out a way that people can borrow money to buy it, you can make that thing much more expensive, right? That's true of houses. That's true of college educations. That's true of automobiles. None of those things in the beginning were bought with debt. But once, and it's brilliant marketing, right, on the part of the people selling these things. So colleges, college today is so much more luxurious than it was when I went to school. It's not just a cost of education. When my daughter was in college in, let's see, from 2010 to 2014, if I remember, her experience was so much more luxurious than mine was back in the 60s and 70s, because colleges have had the money to make it a more luxurious experience. And of course, administrators in colleges are being paid far more money. There's building boom that's gone on in universities because they are flush with all of this borrowed money that's guaranteed by the government. But none of that enhances education, right? So I don't think very many people would argue that the education that kids are getting today is better than the education that I got back when college was cheap.
But is graduating with all that debt going to be worth it, depending on your career choice?
That's part of the I mean, it's going to be, even if you have a lucrative career choice, it's going to be a difficult thing to unwind. And then, of course, there's always, the situation that people go down a path that is potentially lucrative, engineering or medicine or law or what have you. And then for some reason, they don't graduate. I mean, maybe some tragedy happens in their family, those are long journeys. Well, now all the debt stays with you and you didn't get to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. I mean, it's so much risk associated with it. It's just appalling to me. So yeah, no, I'm not a favor. And you may have gathered, but just in case anybody's missing the point, I'm not in favor of debt.
So if you had a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage, and you plan on living there for the foreseeable future, you're not moving anytime soon, is there a certain rate that you would consider paying down the mortgage versus investing into vtsax? Because you're getting a 10% return typically annualized on vtsax, say 10 to 12%. Is there a certain number that you choose between paying your mortgage down or just investing and not planning on looking at that money and just letting it compound?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is if you have a mortgage rate that is somewhere like 3% or less, maybe even 4% or less, that's really cheap money. So I would not be in a hurry to pay that down, right? I think if you had extra money, that you would be better off investing it. I get a little uncomfortable when people talk about, expecting a 10 or 12% return in the market, even though, as we talked about, that was the reality of the 40 years. And I think I can make an argument that returns in the market over the next 40 years are going to be pretty great based on technology and what have you. But I'd be more comfortable saying, I expect about 8%. That's probably conservative. And that's also where the 4% rule comes from, I think, a little bit, that if you expect an 8% return overall, you pull 4% out, you've got another 4% to grow to take care of inflation. So yeah, if your debt is 3-4% or less, then you probably hang on to it. I'd say if it's 6% or more, I'd probably pay it off, because whenever you pay off debt, essentially you're getting a guaranteed return of whatever that interest rate is. So if you pay off a 6% debt, you've got a guaranteed return of 6%, no volatility in it. That's valuable. And of course, if you're looking at something like credit card debt at 18-20%, I mean, it's such a no-brainer to pay it off. And then, between those two, between the 3 to 6%, I think it kind of depends on how you feel about debt and how comfortable you are carrying it. Personally, I paid off my mortgage when it was lower than 6%. I forget exactly where it was. Probably not the best financial decision, clearly not given hindsight, but I just have such an aversion to debt, and I was happy to be rid of it.
Okay. So you also don't like car debt, car loans, looking at a car as a payment, not as the overall cost of the car?
I've never had a car loan. I think,
Do you? No, go ahead. Go ahead.
well, I was going to say, I remember my dad saying, if you have to borrow money, you can't to buy something, you can't afford it. And I think houses might be the one exception to that. And unfortunately, maybe a college education is now, because, for all of my ranting and raving, that is the path we're on. But even with both those things, I would buy the least house that met my needs. And I would, to the best of my ability, avoid the luxury life in college and borrow the least amount of money. But no, I mean, borrowing money for a car, that's nuts. I remember my dad bought a new car every 5 years. And then what he would do, and it's what I do, is he saved up money to pay cash for that car. And then he'd go into the dealership and he'd buy that car for cash, and he'd walk out. And then he'd start sending, quote unquote, a car payment to the bank every month. But it wasn't going to pay off a loan. It was going into a savings account. So the bank was paying him interest. And then at the end of 5 years, there was enough money in that account that the bank had helped build by paying him interest. And then he'd buy his next car. So of course the question becomes, well, how do you save the money for the first car? I mean, once you're in that cycle, it's pretty easy. Well, you do that by driving cheap, junky cars while you save up the money to buy the first car. So that's how I approach buying cars.
Yeah, and you have to look at how much you're paying in interest and what it's worth to you that you could be investing that, and you're getting closer to your FI number. It just depends on how you want to live, basically. Do you want to live with debt? Do you not want to live with debt?
Well, I think it's kind of insane to live with debt. I mean, it's, if you're borrowing money, it's like going into the dealership and saying, oh, that car's $35,000. No, I don't want to pay $35,000. I want to pay much more. Because when you're borrowing money, you're going to pay much more over time than $35,000.
Yeah, without a doubt. If you type it into a computer to see it, it kind of makes more sense compared to just saying, oh, a couple percent, but a couple of percent really adds up over 5-7 years, especially that's what the rates are now long term.
Yeah. Well, of course, car payments are usually not that low, but so.
Yeah. Well, one more thing I wanted to ask you about real estate. Do you think that your primary residence is an investment or not?
Of course not. Don't be silly.
And I think a lot of people look at it as it is, but any emotional decision you make is not going to be a good financial decision.
Yeah, I'm being a little facetious when I say that, but no, I mean, the most infamous post on my blog is titled "Why Your House is a Terrible Investment." Your house is an expensive indulgence, right? And I have nothing against expensive indulgences. I've owned houses most of my adult life. But I've never been silly enough to think of them as an investment. I mean, they're not. Hopefully, not always. And there are a lot of times when houses go down in value. Of course, you don't hear about that, but hopefully your house will increase in value over time. Historically, houses increase at about a percent and a half over time. That's the historical return on single family homes. Now, that's probably shocking to a lot of people listening to this because, of course, they hear the stories of somebody who bought in, say, San Francisco 20 years ago. Well, there are some markets that grow much faster than that. And in fact, the real estate market, evidently, since COVID, has grown much faster than that. But these are anomalies. These are not something that you can count on continuing. So a house is something that hopefully will increase in value at least a little bit. So it's not like a car that is absolutely destined to return to zero value over time. Your house should hold its value at least, and maybe hold its value compared to inflation at least. But it's not an investment. I mean, it's not, your money isn't earning anything in your house, and your house is incredibly expensive to own. People, I hear people saying silly things like, well, I can buy a house and the mortgage payment is the same as what I'm paying for rent, and therefore I'm better off financially. Well, no. I mean, first of all, you're going to tie up a bunch of money in your down payment, which is now not going to be earning you anything. So you have that opportunity cost. You're going to be paying real estate taxes. You're going to be paying insurance. You are going to be paying maintenance and repairs. If you talk to real estate investors, they will typically say of the rental income they get, at least half of it is going to go just to keeping the building alive, right? Most people, they say, well, I want to own a house because then I can make it mine. Okay, that's true. That's kind of the expensive indulgence part of it. Making it yours probably means that you're going to remodel. Well, then you're going to put in a $40,000, $50,000 new kitchen, and that's great. If you can afford it, that's a nice expensive indulgence. But you're never going to see that money back. You're certainly not going to see all of it back. Nobody renting an apartment is going to say, I think I'm going to remodel this kitchen, right? I mean, so that's money that renters are never going to have to spend. If you have a house, you better have a pretty significant emergency fund, because owning a house means you're going to have fiscal emergencies on a semi-regular basis. You're going to have to replace the furnace and the water heater and the roof. If you're a renter, that your fixed rent is all you have to worry about paying each month. So if you're doing this and you're saying, oh, I can get a mortgage and it's the same or even less than my rent, you have only scratched the surface of the costs around owning the house. Not to mention that the commissions for buying and selling the thing are, they're stunningly high compared. That's what it used to cost, 5-6% in commission to buy a stock. Well, those days are gone. You can now trade stocks for nothing. But real estate back when I was a kid cost 5-6% commission to buy or sell. It still does. That's kind of amazing to me in this day and age that they get away with that, but they do. So that means,
well, for most people, they're like, this is the biggest decision they're going to make, and they think it's like the best decision they're ever going to make buying a house, that it's an investment, and they have no idea what they're doing. So sometimes it's helpful, but yeah, the 5-6% is pretty high, but that is the industry standard.
Yeah, well, that means that unless your house goes up 10-12%, you have no chance of breaking even, setting aside whatever you put in investments. People have been sold a myth that houses are a great investment. And there's a lot of money at stake convincing people that they need to own a house. I mean, all those expenses we talked about. The real estate industry has a vested interest. The mortgage industry has a vested interest. The retail has a vested, the people who sell furniture, who sell appliances, who sell remodeling and landscaping services. There's huge economic drivers that benefit from convincing people that this is the American dream and that owning a house is a smart thing to do. And it's just not. It's an expensive indulgence. And again, I indulge myself, but I have always bought my houses from a position of strength, which means I can easily afford them. And I've never bought more house than I needed to meet my needs.
And I think too, my generation, because I'm right around your daughter's age, we kind of didn't see that real estate can go down. We graduated high school in '09. You weren't really looking at the housings until I bought my first house in 2015.
Right.
And it was slowly going up since then. And then 2019, like we talked about during COVID, it's up 40% since then. So everybody thinks that real estate only goes up and that it's the greatest investment you could ever buy. I mean, if you go on any YouTube channel, any social media, you have to buy real estate. It's the greatest thing you could possibly do.
Well, that's part of being sold the bill of goods, and they will look at markets like San Francisco, right? But if you look at a market like Detroit, people who bought houses in Detroit got killed, absolutely destroyed. Now, I was in Detroit last spring, and my friend who lives in the area was taking me on a little tour. Well, Detroit appears to be going through a renaissance. There's a lot of cool things going on in Detroit. And meanwhile, San Francisco, which has done phenomenally well last few decades in real estate, everything I read suggests that San Francisco has some major problems. I'm not predicting this, but it's not hard to just think maybe in 20 years from now, we'll be looking back and saying, boy, those poor people who owned in San Francisco, they got killed. And those people who bought in Detroit 20 years ago, God, they did well. Detroit is blooming. I'm not predicting that. I don't know, but things change, right? So Detroit, that was a disaster, might be the new golden fields. I certainly saw evidence of that. So you can, people will say, well, just buy in the good areas. It's kind of like
that's saying, like buy the good stocks.
Yeah, that's exactly. It's like saying, well, just buy the good stocks. Well, yeah, I mean, that's easier said than done, right? So you just never know what the good areas are going to be in the future.
Because too, the one last thing on stocks is, I think you said over the course, how many stocks actually last? Like, what's the longest lasting stock in actual vtsax? Because they basically come and go. That's the good part about it.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I used to, if you look at the Dow Jones, which is the 30 Dow Jones Industrials, which are 30 representative stocks of the economy, at least theoretically. And, that goes back to, I want to say, the late 1800s, like 1880 or something. And it was maybe 20 stocks in those days. Well, back 15 years ago, I used to be able to say, how many of those original companies do you think are still in the Dow Jones? And the answer used to be one, and it was GE, right? And of course, GE is still around, but GE is no longer in the Dow Jones Industrial because GE has fallen on hard times. So there is no stock in the Dow Jones that has been there since the beginning. Companies have lifestyles. They like life cycles, rather. They come and go. And it's tempting for people in a given moment to say, well, gee, Amazon will always be dominant, or Walmart will always be dominant. Well, those are certainly two dominant retail forces in the market, probably the two most dominant retail forces in the market. But one of the few advantages of being an old guy is I can remember when that was Sears. And Sears dominated the retail market for 100 years. I mean, going back to Sears was really the pioneer of what Jeff Bezos did with Amazon. Sears came out with their catalog, and they basically said, there's a huge rural population in the United States, this is back in the 1800s, that don't have access to our stores, because they were also the Walmart of their day. So we're going to send this catalog out to them. They can order stuff from us, and then we will have it delivered to them. Does that sound familiar? Right? Well, that was a brilliant formula then, just like it's a brilliant formula for Amazon. And Sears absolutely dominated retail for 100 years. They built It's now been renamed, but what was the tallest building in the world back in the 70s, that what was then the Sears Tower, which was kind of the beginning of the end. There's something about building trophy buildings that seems to mark the beginning of the end of these companies. And now, you're hard pressed to find a Sears store.
I was going to say, yeah, all the malls, they're pretty much gone from all the malls.
They're all gone, right? And so, but that too will happen to Walmart and Amazon at some point. I don't know how it's going to. Even Jeff Bezos has said he expects that somebody will come along and usurp Amazon's position, because he's a smart guy. He knows that that's how things work. And I don't know when that's going to happen. For Sears, it took 100 years, so these can be long cycle things. But yeah, but I don't have to worry about it. I own Amazon, but I own it through vtsax. So as long as Amazon is prosperous and dominant and doing well, I will own it. When they start to fade away, just like when Sears was doing well, I owned it. When it starts to fade away, it becomes less and less of a factor, and I own the new kids that are taking over.
Exactly. Just to close up, can you tell us a little about your new book, Pathfinders?
Yeah, sure. So this is it. Pathfinders. There we go. Pathfinders is a book that I wanted to do for years, because when The Simple Path to Wealth came out in 2016, probably about six months after that, I started hearing these stories from people about how much the book had meant to them and how they'd taken the principles in the book and adapted it to their particular situation. And what was striking to me is I wrote The Simple Path to Wealth for my daughter. She was in college at the time, so at the very beginning of her journey. She's an American. And I started hearing from people all over the world responding to this very US-centric book, and from people who weren't at the beginning of their path, but who, were in their 30s or 40s or 50s, 60s, and how they were using the principles to unwind some of the things they wish they hadn't done and go. And I thought that was endlessly fascinating. And so Pathfinders is a collection of about 100 of these kinds of stories drawn from people all over the world, all different stages of their journey. And I think it's immensely inspirational. And it's broken down into 9 sections, everything from debt, which is one of them, and savings, and lifestyle inflation, which is a big obstacle to becoming financially independent, to what we titled Endgame, which is what does it look like when you're there? And with these inspirational stories, and at each section, I provide my commentary on the subject and the stories, and yeah, I think it is everything I hoped it would be. And a lot of people have told me that they will buy The Simple Path to Wealth to give to their children or their friends or whatever. And I think that's great. But I've come to think that maybe Pathfinders is even the better book to give to somebody for whom this is all new. Because in Pathfinders, they'll find stories from people of all different kinds of backgrounds, people starting from extraordinarily humble positions. There's a guy in Pathfinders who was a migrant laborer as a kid. He was picking asparagus, and now, he's worth several $100,000. There's stories from a person who talks about when they were a kid, the rich people were the ones who had the flush toilets. So coming from extraordinarily humble beginnings and is achieving extraordinary results, because a lot of the pushback to this when people first hear about it is, well, that sounds impossible. I mean, how does an ordinary person do that? Well, in Pathfinders, you have the answer to that. So I think if you want to introduce somebody to the idea of being financially independent, this is 100 stories of people who have done it or are in the process of doing it. And then if that book resonates, The Simple Path to Wealth tells you exactly how to do it yourself.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking almost the opposite way though, because I've read both. I'm almost finished Pathfinders. I'm at the point where you're interviewing your daughter. It's not you interviewing, but it's the three of you. And I
Right.
was thinking if you read The Simple Path to Wealth and you get the idea of what you're supposed to do, and you're like, I can't do this, well, then you're going to read a book, Pathfinders, and that's going to be able to link you to someone who's done it from your situation. Now you can say, wait, if they did it, why can't I?
Well, I guess you can do it either way.
Exactly.
My concern would be that if you read The Simple Path to Wealth and your reaction is, yeah, that sounds great, but it's really not practical for me. I doubt if you're going to pick up Pathfinders.
Okay. Yeah, you'll just give up and be like, that's it. I'm done. I'm good.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I don't want to read anything more. Whereas if you read Pathfinders, if you read Pathfinders and, if you read these stories and your reaction is, yeah, okay, I still don't want to do it. Well, yeah, I don't, then you're not going to do it. And most people, let's be honest, most people are not going to do this.
True.
The people who follow The Simple Path to Wealth are unicorns. And in my view, probably always will be. But if you pick up Pathfinders and you read it, when you're done with Pathfinders, you will not be able to set it down and say, honestly, I can't do this. You have read too many stories of people who have done it and probably faced bigger obstacles than you face. Now, you can still choose to say, I don't want to do it. But if Pathfinders resonates with you, then Simple Path to Wealth will tell you exactly how to do it. So that's kind of how I think about it. But yeah, I mean, I just hope, I'm under no illusion that either of these books are going to change the world in that, large numbers of people are going to start doing it. I hope that a lot of people who read the books do follow the path because it leads to such wonderful things. But at least if you read either of these books, you will know that this is a path that is available. I think to me, there's no well, I guess there's tragedy in somebody who reads either or both of these books and says, no, I'm not going to do it. That feels kind of sad to me because there's just so many great benefits to it. But maybe even more tragic is somebody who gets to be my age and suddenly finds out about this and says, my God, if only I'd known, if only I'd known. And at least if you read these two books, you will know. And then if you choose not to do it, well, at least you're making the choice with the knowledge of what's possible.
Yeah, you'll have to live with that regret later in life when you don't have any money saved up or invested to live on.
Well, right, and that I think is the tragedy, and and again, it's everybody has their own life to live. It's their money; they could spend it however they like. But if you read these two books and you say, "Nah, I still want to drive the fancy car and buy the biggest house that the bank will lend me money for," well, okay, it's your money, it's your life. You can do whatever you want. I don't want to hear from you in 30 years saying, "Oh, I don't have any money to retire on. Poor me."
Yeah, you make your own bed in life. That's one of the things people have lost kind of track of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we would be well served to get back to it. So
Absolutely. JL, thank you for sharing your time with us today.
hey, it's been a lot of fun for me, Steve. I hope it was for you and the people listening. And thanks again for having me.